Most people are told the same comforting lie about investing. Start early. Put in what you can. Let compound interest do the heavy lifting. The sentence sounds wise because part of it is true. Compound interest is real. Time matters, starting matters, discipline matters. But the way this idea is sold to ordinary people hides the most important number in the entire equation. It hides the monthly contribution level below which compounding may be technically present, but functionally too weak to change your life for a very long time. I want to be very precise about this because precision is where people stop feeling ashamed and start seeing clearly. Compound interest is not useless. What is useless is expecting compounding to rescue a contribution level that never gives it enough capital to work with. That is the distinction almost nobody explains. If you invest $50 a month at an 8% annual return and you keep doing it for a full year without missing a single month, your return is roughly the cost of a lunch. After 10 years, you have something. After 30 years, you still have something. But that something is not a retirement. It is not freedom. It is not a paycheck replacement. It is not even close. That does not mean you failed. It means you were sold the engine without being told the RPM where the turbo actually starts to work. When I look at money, I try to reduce it to mechanism. I do not like vague language. I do not like slogans. I do not like motivational noise that makes people feel good today and poor later. And the mechanism here is simple. There are two phases in building wealth. In the first phase, you are carrying the entire machine on your back. In the second phase, the machine begins to carry you. Most people think they are in one long continuous journey called investing. They are not. They are moving through two completely different regimes with two completely different laws. In the first phase, your monthly contribution is the main engine. In the second phase, the size of the pile becomes the engine. If you do not understand that difference, you will misread your results, become frustrated at exactly the wrong moment, and abandon the strategy just before it becomes powerful. That is how people lose decades. Let me show you what I mean. The average long-term return of the S&P 500 has been around 10% a year before inflation across very long stretches of history. Adjust for inflation and you get something closer to 7%. So let us use 8%. Not a fantasy, not a salesman S number, not the kind of figure somebody uses when they want to make a chart look gorgeous, just a sober, serviceable number. Now run the math at $50 a month after 10 years, you end up with about $9,200. Read that slowly. 10 years, a decade of discipline, a decade of saying no to something else every month, and you end with about $9,200. Most of that is not the market carrying you. Most of that is you carrying the market. Almost $6,000 came directly from your own deposits. Less than $3,200 came from growth after 30 years of perfect discipline. No missed month, no panic, no interruption. The number reaches roughly $74,500. If you are honest, that number should not comfort you. It should educate you, because 30 years is not a warm-up. 30 years is a working lifetime. And after that kind of discipline, you do not have a machine that replaced your labor. You have a pool of money that can help, but not save you. Now move the monthly contribution to $200. Same return, same market, same 30 years. Now the final number is about $298,000. Move it to $400 a month, and the final number rises to roughly $596,000. Nothing magical changed except the amount going in each month. Same compounding law, same time, same investor, different fuel. That is why I say the first great lie in personal finance is not that compounding works. The first great lie is that the contribution level barely matters as long as you just start. Number starting matters, but staying too small for too long matters even more. I want you to think about compound interest the way an engineer thinks about forced induction in an engine. A turbocharger is a beautiful invention, but it has a threshold. Before the engine spins fast enough, the turbo is technically there, but you cannot feel it. The car moves because the engine itself is doing the work. Fuel goes in, power comes out, everything is direct. Then the RPM rises, pressure builds, the system begins feeding on its own output, and suddenly the car feels completely different. The machine is still the same machine, but now the boost is alive. The output has changed categories. Your portfolio works the same way. Before a certain balance, compounding is present, but not yet forceful enough to transform the experience of the portfolio. You see little gains, you feel little progress, you remain the source of almost all motion. Then at some point, usually somewhere around $100,000 to $150,000 in invested assets, depending on contribution rate and market conditions. The relationship changes. The returns begin to rival the deposits. The deposits are still important, but they are no longer carrying the whole burden. That is the phase transition. That is the moment most people never even know they are trying to reach. And if you do not know you are trying to reach it, you do not organize your life properly around it. You think the game is to pick the right ETF, chase a slightly higher return, argue about sectors, compare fund expenses down to the last basis point, and search for a better strategy. That is not the game in phase one. In phase one, the game is brutal in its simplicity. Get the pile large enough for the percentage to matter. That is it. Everything else is decoration. I have watched countless people misunderstand this. They invest for a few years, maybe 5, maybe 7, maybe 9, and they stare at the number on the screen and think, this cannot be all there is. Then they make the most expensive mistake in early investing. They do not conclude that their contribution level is too low. They conclude that their return rate is too low. That diagnosis feels intelligent, it feels sophisticated, it feels like the kind of thing a serious investor would say. It is usually wrong. If you are contributing $200 a month and earning 8%, your 10-year number is roughly $36,800. Now suppose you somehow find a way to double your annual return to 16% for 10 straight years. That sounds wonderful. It also sounds like the kind of promise that destroys people. But let us pretend you can do it. Now after 10 years, you have roughly $52,200. Yes, that is better. But look carefully at what happened. You doubled the return rate. You accepted vastly more volatility. You exposed yourself to behavioral mistakes, stress, timing risk, and the temptation to think you are smarter than the market. And after all that, the gain over the boring strategy is roughly $15,000 over a full decade. Now compare that with a different move. Leave the return at 8%. Do not become a genius. Do not become a trader. Do not become a prophet. Just raise the contribution from $200 a month to $350 a month. Now your 10-year value becomes roughly $64,000, higher than the fantasy 16% scenario. Lower risk, lower stress, better odds, fewer opportunities to do something stupid. This is not philosophy. This is arithmetic. The reason people hate this arithmetic is that it removes drama. It tells you the answer is probably not hidden in a hot stock, a newsletter, a guru, or some clever angle nobody else understands. The answer, especially in phase one, is usually a bigger monthly contribution. That is unglamorous. That does not sell products. That does not create an exciting identity. Nobody feels like a genius increasing an auto contribution by $50. But that is exactly why so few people get rich from boring investing. They keep trying to substitute cleverness for fuel. Let me put a face on this. Imagine a man named Marcus. Marcus is 38. He works in logistics management. He earns decent money, not celebrity money, not Wall Street money, just solid middle-class money. A few years ago, his company launched a retirement plan. He did the responsible thing. He enrolled. He picked a diversified, low-cost fund. He set the contribution at $150 a month. 8 years later, his balance is about $16,500. He has done nothing wrong. He has been disciplined. He has not panic sold. He has not become reckless. He has done the thing every book told him to do. And now he is quietly disappointed. He does not announce it. He does not complain online. He just feels it. He looks at the account and thinks, I have been doing this for 8 years. Is this really what everybody gets so excited about? That thought is where fortunes are won or lost. Because right there, in that moment, Marcus can make one of two interpretations. He can say the strategy is broken, or he can say the strategy is working exactly as designed, but I am still in the first phase. If he says the strategy is broken, he starts hunting for excitement. He reads about small caps. He hears a friend talking about options. He redirects contributions to a stock he barely understands. He tells himself he needs higher performance. If he says he is still in the first phase, a different question appears. How do I get to the threshold faster? That is the better question. Suppose Marcus keeps contributing $150 a month until 65. He ends up around $121,000. That is not retirement capital. That is retirement assistance. Now suppose he raises the number to $400 a month. At 65, he reaches about $337,000. Now suppose he gets to $600 a month. At 65, he reaches roughly $537,000. Same person, same market, same intelligence, same time horizon, different monthly input. That is why phase one is not mainly about investing brilliance. It is about system design. People hate hearing that because it sounds too plain, but plain truths tend to survive longer than exciting lies. The first level of system design is contribution right-sizing. Most people set a contribution once during some administrative moment and never touch it again. That number is often chosen in a state of mild inconvenience. They are opening the account, filling forms, thinking about work, maybe standing in a hallway, maybe half listening to an HR presentation. They type a number that feels painless, then the number freezes there for years. Income changes, costs change, their life changes, the contribution stays exactly where it was born. That is not a financial plan. That is administrative inertia pretending to be a plan. The simplest useful move is not complicated. Log in and raise the contribution by $50. Not whatever, not some life sentence, just 50. Then put a reminder on the calendar for every January to review it again. That one habit does more for ordinary investors than most of the content they consume all year. The second level is what I call income growth redirection. Raises are dangerous, bonuses are dangerous, tax refunds are dangerous, not because money is dangerous, but because unassigned money disappears into lifestyle with astonishing speed. People do not consciously decide to waste it. The money just diffuses. A nicer dinner here, a subscription there, a better version of something already owned. By the time 6 months pass, the new income has become ordinary, and the chance to redirect it into capital has vanished. If you want to build wealth intelligently, do not ask your future self to decide later. Make the rule now: every net income increase gets split. Half goes to life, half goes to the portfolio. That way your life still improves, but your future does too. No asceticism, no monk routine, no fake poverty, just discipline with a split. That is how people become wealthy without feeling like they are living in punishment. The third level is life event contribution resets. When a car loan ends, something important happens. A stream of cash flow is suddenly freed. The same thing happens when a student loan ends. A refinance lowers a payment, or a child becomes financially independent. If you do nothing at those moments, the freed cash disappears into the background of life. If you act immediately, those are some of the most powerful contribution jumps available to an ordinary household. A person who redirects even $250 to $400 of a finished car payment into investments changes the future in a way that will feel absurdly disproportionate later. Why? Because the timing is everything. A dollar invested early is not just a dollar. It is an employee with a 30-year contract. A dollar invested late is a temporary worker. That difference is why the first 5 years of your investing journey matter more than the final 5, even though the late years look more dramatic on paper. A dollar invested in month 1 of a 30-year journey becomes many times more powerful than a dollar added near the end. That is why drifting in the early years is so expensive. People think small delays are small costs. They are not. They are costs levied against the most valuable dollars in your entire lifetime. And that leads to another mistake I need to warn you about: fees. People talk about fees as if they are an annoyance. They are not an annoyance. They are silent confiscation. If your portfolio earns 8% before fees and you give away 1% annually, you are not just losing 1%. You are losing the compounding of every 1% that left and never had the chance to keep working. That difference becomes enormous over decades. The tragedy is that in phase 1, the fee looks harmless. When the account is small, the dollar fee looks small. A person shrugs at it. They say it is worth it for advice or peace of mind or professional management. Then 30 years later, they discover that $250,000 quietly walked out the back door. This is why I have such respect for simplicity. Complexity often pretends to be wisdom. Sometimes it is only extraction dressed in better language. Now, I want to say something that may sound harsh, but I mean it kindly. A lot of people are not failing because they started too late. They are failing because they stayed too small too long and then used complexity to distract themselves from that fact. They studied returns instead of studying fuel. They debated funds instead of increasing deposits. They looked for better charts instead of better cash flow architecture. That is the common trap. And because so many people fall into it, the emotional damage becomes part of the journey. The brain wants visible progress. Human beings continue behaviors that produce visible results and abandon behaviors that seem to produce nothing. Phase 1 is cruel because it asks for disciplined effort while giving back results so modest that the brain misreads them as failure. The portfolio is working, the brain says it is broken. That gap is where investors betray themselves. They switch strategies, they start trading, they buy stories instead of systems, they become active at exactly the point when passivity was statistically doing them the most good. I am not saying nobody ever outperforms, of course some people do, but for the ordinary investor in phase 1, the objective is not to become extraordinary in the market. The objective is to become relentless in contribution. That is what gets you over the line. That is what gets you into the second phase. and the second phase feels different. You will know when you begin to touch it. You open the statement and the return line is no longer a joke. It is not lunch money, it is not gas money, it is rent money, it is real monthly output. At around $100,000, 8% is about $8,000 a year. That is more than $600 a month. At $500,000, 8% is about $40,000 a year. Same percentage, different life. That is when the machine starts speaking back in a language you can feel. People then make a strange mistake in reverse. Once they reach phase 2, they often underestimate how little the old frugality habits matter compared to the giant benefit of having reached the threshold at all. The packed lunches mattered in phase 1 because they funded contributions. Once the pile is large, the lunch itself is not the engine anymore. The pile is. That is why the first decade often feels hard and the later decade sometimes feels almost unfairly easy. The rules changed even if nobody announced the transition. I think about Andrew Hall often in this context, the school teacher who retired a millionaire on a teacher's salary. Most people look at that story and see thrift. I see sequence. I see a man who understood, whether explicitly or instinctively, that the early years were the years to force the engine into boost. Once he got there, the machine began to pull with him. The final years looked easy because the hard structural work had already been done. That is what outsiders often miss about financial success. They see the visible years and ignore the ignition years. They see the statement at $700,000 and not the dull years at $12,000 and $18,000 and $26,000, where the owner kept going anyway. They see the harvest and miss the seed years. Now let me come back to the claim in the title, is compounding useless? If you invest too little every month, not mathematically, but functionally, for a very long stretch of your life. It can feel close enough to useless that the distinction stops helping you. That is why the statement is provocative. But the point is sober. The issue is not whether compounding works. The issue is whether you are contributing enough, early enough, long enough for compounding to become a force that can actually alter the shape of your life. That is the only question that matters. And once you see it that way, your priorities become much cleaner. You stop obsessing over squeezing a little more return out of a fund selection question. You stop fantasizing about becoming a better speculator than institutions. You stop confusing entertainment with investing. You manage the threshold date. You ask, how quickly can I get this engine into boost? How can I move my crossing point 2 years earlier? What do I need to reassign in my life to make that happen? That is the right obsession, because 2 years earlier in phase 2 can be worth an astonishing amount of terminal wealth. Not because the market changed, but because the machine had 2 extra years to work on its own. This is where wealthy people often look very disciplined from the outside. But what they are really doing is building financial architecture. They do not rely on inspiration. They do not wait for motivation. They create systems that move cash into capital before life can absorb it. And that is what I want for you. Not heroics, not adrenaline, not one big win. Architecture, a structure that keeps doing the smart thing even when you are tired, distracted, or bored. So here is what I would do tonight. First, find your current monthly contribution and compare it to the monthly return line on your last statement. If your contribution still dwarfs the return, accept that you are in phase 1. That is not shameful, that is useful. It tells you exactly where to focus. Second, calculate the year you cross $100,000 at your current contribution rate. Then calculate what happens if you raise your monthly contribution by $5,100 or $200. You are not managing a return number. You are managing a threshold date. Third, pre-decide your next income event. The next raise, the next bonus. The next loan that ends, decide now what percentage gets redirected into investments and automate it before the money arrives. That is how ordinary people create extraordinary outcomes. They do not wait to feel ready. They do not wait until they are experts. They do not wait until compounding feels magical. They keep feeding the engine until the machine can finally help. Once you understand the 2 phases, investing stops being mysterious. It becomes demanding. Yes, but it becomes clear. In phase 1, you are not trying to become a market wizard. You are building a pile. You are building the thing the percentages will later act upon. You are building the machine. And if you stay with it, there comes a point where the machine begins building you a different life. That is when the whole thing starts to make sense. Not because the charts were lying, but because the charts never told you where the real threshold lived. Now you know, and once you know, the decision becomes less emotional and more mechanical. Raise the fuel, advance the threshold, protect the early dollars, ignore the noise. Let the math take over when it is finally big enough to do so. That is how compounding becomes useful, not by being worshipped. by being reached.